one philosophy I've taken the whole time is, look, if we can make this work, then hopefully we really can make a difference and we can really change the world and work with local communities to bring reefs back to life.
Welcome to the Business for Good podcast,
a show where we, Paul Shapiro and Tony Okamoto,
spotlight companies making money by helping solve some of the world's most pressing problems. Tony and I were recently in Florida visiting my parents for Thanksgiving, during which my friend Ari was kind enough to take me scuba diving with him. It was great. We saw some really cool animals, but while learning about how imperiled coral reefs are, I started wondering, was there a business case to be made for trying to save the reefs? Well, it turns out that, unsurprisingly, we were not the first people to think of this. In fact, already a startup called Coral Vita, based, yes, in the Bahamas, is pioneering on-land coral farming techniques that involve rapidly growing corals at 50 times the pace they'd normally grow, and then transplanting them onto imperiled reefs. As you'll hear, Coral Vita has won all types of awards and has now raised $1.6 million in capital for their startup so far. In this episode, we are thrilled to have Coral Vita co-founder Sam Teicher to talk all things relating to the business of saving coral reefs.
Welcome to the latest episode, dear listeners. This is coming out during the winter, so we're going to transport you in this interview to the warmth of the sunny Bahamas. So we started researching online, and indeed, there's a lot of money in keeping reefs alive. Hotels want thriving reefs for their tourists to snorkel over, scuba centers want reefs for the same reason, and more. So couldn't there be a business in restoring reefs? And even if you don't have the kind of money to invest, you can still help them restore reefs through their Adopt a Coral program. How cute is that?
Welcome to the show, Sam.
Welcome, Sam.
Great to be here. Thanks so much for having me on.
All right, Sam, let me ask one basic question for listeners to get started. What are coral reefs? Are they animals, plants, something else? And why are they so important?
It's a great question, and it's one that we often get asked because corals are quite fascinating creatures. So at the end of the day, they are animals that have plants living inside of them that in turn make rock. So corals are these organisms. They're related distantly to jellyfish, but they are animals that have this tissue-like skin within them that has algae living inside of them. So when we think of coral reefs and Finding Nemo, the Great Barrier Reef, and we think of all the beautiful colors that come from corals, that color often comes from the algae living within inside the corals. And that algae has got a nice symbiotic, friendly relationship with the corals, and basically through photosynthesis feeds the coral. And so when we see these giant reef structures, it's colonies of these corals living side by side, growing out, and forming these massive ecosystems that in turn are one of the most important in the world. So I have been a scuba diver since I was a kid, so I've been in love with the ocean and reefs since childhood. But if you're not an environmentalist and you're wondering why do reefs matter, it's actually it's a good question worth asking, and reefs are one of the most important natural ecosystems on the planet, not just for wildlife, but for humanity. So all told, coral reefs support over a quarter of all marine life, while sustaining the livelihoods, food security, and jobs for up to 1 billion people around the world in nearly 100 countries and territories. So if we think about how does that come to be, there are people who like to go snorkeling and scuba diving. And we like white sandy beaches. People love to go fishing or to eat seafood, or if they live near the coast, often notice that they get a nice little buffer from storm surges and erosion when you have a coral reef off your property. And so all told, through tourism, fisheries, and coastal protection, reefs conservatively generate about $30 billion a year. So when we think about the number of people, the amount of wildlife, and all that value, it's pretty clear that reefs are incredibly important for all of us everywhere. And the bad news is that we've lost more than half the world's reefs since the 1970s. And are projected to lose over 90% by 2050. So this is not just an ecological catastrophe, but a socioeconomic crisis. And that's why we need to do everything possible to keep reefs healthy for future generations, because we all depend on them.
Wow, half of them lost in just the last half century. That's really remarkable. So before we get to more, I want to just ask this question about coral being animals, because I knew nothing about whether corals were animals until researching for this interview. But what I read is that they are rooted in the ground. So it's not like they're animals who walk around on the seafloor. They're rooted in the ground, but they are animals in that they don't produce their own food in the way a plant does. They actually have to obtain food from their environment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not that corals are conscious in the way that an animal is. Like the coral, like is it that you think that corals are aware of what's going on, or do you think that they are more like a plant in that sense, so they may not be aware of what's going on?
I mean, if I had the chance to interview a coral, I'd love to get the answer. But
one day,
I definitely think that, I mean, there are corals that fight with each other when they're competing for space. They all have this remarkable feature where they often synchronize when they breed in the wild, often in the summertime underneath the full moon. So there's definitely a degree at which corals have, a synchronized cohabitation with each other and with the life forms around them. Whether or not they're able to break down, philosophies on how they want about growing and moving and eating, that's a different story. But they definitely have a form of sort of impressive lifestyles that I find remarkable, as do many people all around the world.
Right. So you don't have some reefs that are under communism and some under capitalism and others under something else.
Not that I know of yet, no.
Okay, so Sam, recently Tony and I were visiting my parents for Thanksgiving in Florida, and my friend Ari took me out scuba diving. We went out scuba diving 3 mornings in a row. It was really, really amazing. And I was talking to this guy who's like a scuba diving pro, and I asked him, I said, it was cool to see. We saw fish and stingrays and lobsters. And I asked him, I was like, if this had been 20 years ago, would we have seen more animals living on this coral reef? He said it would have been dramatically more. And I asked him, I said, well, what are the biggest reasons for the decline? And he mentioned a few, mainly, of course, climate change, which we can get into. He also said that sunscreen from tourists was a big problem that I'd love to get your opinion on. And he also noted that beach widening projects were a big problem for coral reefs in Florida, that when you dredge sand from the ocean and put it on the beach to give a wider beach for tourists, that oftentimes it goes back into the ocean and covers the nearby coral reefs, basically smothering them. He also said that sugar plantations are very bad because they have a lot of toxic runoff for coral reefs. But if you could tell us, I mean, independent of Florida, just generally speaking, why are coral reefs dying?
Well, you definitely hit a number of the key ones, and they're dying in different places for similar reasons, but also different reasons. I will just touch on Florida real quick because, I'm American, and Florida Keys used to be one of the pride and joys for the United States when it comes to their reef track. It's one of the biggest in the world, but we've lost almost 95% of it dead.
Wow.
Since the 70s. There's nothing natural about that. And so when we think about people wanting to go fishing and snorkeling and scuba diving, it's almost like a wasteland there compared to what it once was. Some places are not as harmed, but even places as iconic as the Great Barrier Reef, up to half of it died over the past few years. And
Sam, for people who don't know what the Great Barrier Reef is, you mind just briefly telling us?
Sure. I think it's one of the natural wonders of the world. It's over 3,000-mile long stretch of reef along the eastern coast of Australia that is home to some of the most iconic wildlife and species on the planet, and has wowed explorers going back to James Cook. It was sacred to Aboriginals. It's a destination for people from all around the world. It was, the home of Nemo in the Pixar Finding Nemo film. So it's just one of the most incredible places on Earth. And when you think about something as big and iconic as it, often when things are in the ocean, they're out of sight, out of mind. And so over the past few years, largely due to spikes in ocean temperature combined with some local pollution, over half of it died. And if we think about, if half the Amazon or half of Yellowstone disappeared within a few years, it would be, a total outrage. But it's, I think, passed by a lot of folks just because of how we comprehend and value the ocean. But thinking about that, just going back to your original question, you basically have local and global factors that are impacting reef health. So on the local level, you already touched on a few of them. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that pollution can kill life. And so when you've got, sewage runoff or from septic systems or, uncontrolled agricultural runoff, all those things can contribute to conditions that can kill corals and other forms of life. Overfishing, Now, this is coming from someone that likes to go fishing and likes to eat fish. I'm not, arguing against ending it completely, but when you do it the wrong ways, whether because you're trawling or you're catching too many fish or you're not catching, them at the right age in their life cycle so they can't reproduce. Basically, corals compete with algae. They compete with this, the green slimy stuff that you sometimes find in seafloors. And when corals die, algae takes over. And if you don't have herbivorous fish that are eating that algae, then the algae will continue to grow and the coral never come back. So overfishing contributes to it. Runoff, as you touched on, from sedimentation. Corals need sunlight, so when they get buried by sand from bad coastal development practices, that can kill the coral. And then there are some forms of sunscreen, many of which are chemical based, that do have these chemicals that harm coral health. And on the global level, and we're already seeing this now, and it's really only going to get worse, driven by climate change, warming and acidifying oceans are killing corals. These corals only have a certain temperature range that they can sort of live, thrive, and reproduce in. And if it gets too hot or too cold, the corals, they do something called bleaching. And I can go into more detail about that, but bleaching can lead to coral death. And in the past few years, when half the Great Barrier Reef died, that was largely due to spikes in ocean temperature. So you take all those things combined, again, globally, all around the world, that is what is largely killing coral reefs.
What kinds of sunscreen are harming coral? That's something that our audience can change and help the ocean.
Yeah, so I would recommend just organizations that have great lists of which sunscreens are safe for corals. So the Environmental Working Group, or EWG, they usually have good lists on good products, but largely it's sunscreens that have oxybenzone that have been found to be harmful for coral reefs. And so there's certain countries and states, so Hawaii, the country of Palau in the Pacific, they're starting to implement bans on these sort of reef harming sunscreens. Typically, the ones that are better for the reef health and for marine health are zinc based. So for the listeners, I recommend them checking out these Environmental Working Group and others who have these lists. There are companies specifically making reef safe sunscreens, and largely look for zinc based sunscreens so that you personally won't have a negative impact on the reefs when you go out to visit them.
Cool. So you mentioned you have been scuba diving since you were a child, and I imagine that the ocean has been a love of yours since then. But what got you so passionate about coral reefs?
I think it was just the first time I got to, have fun around them. So my parents got my brother and I scuba certifications when we were kids. Growing up in DC, that might not be the first thing to come to mind. The Potomac River doesn't really have, magnificent coral reefs, but we were lucky enough whenever we had a family trip over the holidays and we got to go somewhere tropical. My brother, my dad, and I would go scuba diving, and my mom would snorkel. And I personally think it's like, many of us dream of being astronauts when we're kids, and to be able to sort of float underwater in an almost zero G environment, breathing and seeing this totally wild, alien looking, brilliant life. That's often very curious about people. And so it often can be, a very interactive experience. There just was nothing better than that. And then it's even more remarkable when you recognize this is just off our shore, just underwater. Whether you're in the tropics or you're in the Arctic, Pacific Northwest, Red Sea, Eastern Africa, it doesn't matter where you go in the world. There's just some absolutely remarkable and super fun stuff out there. And so that's just kind of where I fell in love with coral reefs, was from those experiences diving since I was a kid.
Okay, so getting to the business of saving reefs, tell us about Coral Vita, the company that you co-founded, and can you tell us also about coral farming and how it works?
Sure. So I'm one of the founders of Coral Vita, which is a company that grows corals to restore dying reefs. So I founded this company out of the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, where I was getting my master's with my co-founder, Gator Halpern. And his name really is Gator. Great name for what we're doing. Brothers are Moose and Griffin. So we got the whole animal kingdom behind what we're all about. And Gator and I both were in grad school, and we're thinking about how, from our previous backgrounds, there's these massive environmental crises and problems that we're not just on the horizon, but we're present right now, that policy and nonprofits and academia weren't solving at the scale or urgency and effectiveness as was needed. So I came from more of a nonprofit and policy background. Gator had more experience in sort of the academic track. And we sort of felt, well, what if there are private sector solutions? What if business can be a force for good, and sort of break through some of these roadblocks that the other sectors weren't able to sort of navigate? And Gator grew up in San Diego, so he also had a lifelong love for the ocean. And we coalesced around this experience I had prior to grad school living out in Mauritius. So I took a gap year and lived in the country of Mauritius out in the Indian Ocean. A friend of mine was a Mauritian guy, started up this nonprofit called Eli Africa. And it was a community-based education organization. And he wanted me to set up the environmental branch of this group. And while I was out there, I had the awesome experience of getting a UN grant in partnership with the Mauritius Oceanography Institute to set up this coral farm. And I'll sort of go into more details about what's behind coral farming, but basically it's a project where corals are grown, installed into reefs to revive the ecosystem's health. And we saw fishermen setting up their traps 100 yards away from our restoration site because there were so many more fish. So there was this experience where, wow, we really can make a difference in the right conditions to help revive reef health. But it also was clear in that space that getting one grant from one organization to restore part of one lagoon wasn't going to cut it, given we're projected to lose 90% of the world's reefs by 2050. That grant and donation funding model, small scale projects, it just wasn't enough. And so Gator and I together came up with this idea for Coral Vita, being a mission-driven company working to scale up reef restoration all around the world. So we teamed up with two of the world's leading coral scientists, Dr. David Vaughn of the Mote Marine Laboratory down in Florida, as well as Dr. Ruth Gates of the University of Hawaii, who tragically last month actually passed away due to brain cancer.
I'm so sorry.
Appreciate it. Yeah, she's really, your listeners should look her up. She really is a tremendous inspiration. Even, after she's gone, she's the president of the International Society of Reef Studies, and she just had this relentless doggedness and optimism about no matter how big the problem is, we can solve it. And so she was a pioneer, and her work continues around this field known as assisted evolution to strengthen the resiliency of corals to warming and acidifying ocean, these big threats for them moving forward. So integrating Dr. Gates' methods to strengthen coral resiliency, and then Dr. Vaughn's methods, he figured out this way to grow corals up to 50 times faster, which translates into months instead of decades. So integrating those methods into our business model, where looking at those values I mentioned before, tourism, fisheries, coastal protection, rather than applying to one-off grants to support small-scale projects. Well, what if hotels that depend on scuba tourists, or governments with national economic interests, coastal property owners, insurers whose homes or properties are threatened by storm surge? Basically, get everyone with skin in the game from coral reef values to pay to restore the reefs they depend on. And so that is basically the essence of Coral Vita: growing more diverse and resilient and affordable corals, and selling the service of reef restoration to customers that depend on healthy reefs. And then the sort of final element of the business model is that as we do this coral farming work, which we do on land, we turn our coral farms into tourism attractions and education centers, so that people visiting the countries that we're working in can sort of have the experience of seeing us growing corals, learn about what's happening. And if they're really excited, they can adopt corals for their friends and family, pay to plant them with our teams, or get reef restoration dive certifications, all while these farms also become sort of places where local community members and students can learn about what's happening to reefs and sort of become empowered to be the next generation of marine biologists and reef stewards for the future.
I have a bit of a personal question. Paul went scuba diving last week, and he was talking about how he was so excited to see the wildlife. And it was my opinion that I would love to leave the wildlife alone and let them be. Do you think that it's helpful for the wildlife, for people to see them and see how beautiful they are, to want to change their habits and to be more conscious of their impact on the oceans?
Yeah, I think that having the ability to experience wildlife in a responsible manner not only is just a worthwhile life experience, but often is the inspiration for people to really care about certain issues. So you definitely, need to be cognizant of, whether it's putting on the right sunscreen or, not grabbing the sort of flippers of a turtle or touching the coral, behaving in the right way. But it's just like, you go on safaris, and if it's managed correctly, it often leads to people contributing to wilderness conservation or anti-poaching efforts and whatnot. So I think nature-based tourism and ecotourism is on the rise. We need, regulators and operators and everyone involved to make sure that people are engaging with the environment in the appropriate manner. But ultimately, I think it actually can be a huge force for good because it, like I said before, really can get people even more excited about the environment as well as motivated to help protect it.
Cool. Thanks, Sam. I appreciate you letting me off the hook here.
Doing what I can.
Let me just ask you briefly. So you mentioned that you are growing at 50 times as fast and that it's also resilient. Now, to the untrained ear, people might be thinking, well, how the heck is this guy doing that? Is he genetically modifying the coral? Can you just briefly tell us how you get it to grow 50 times faster than it does in nature and why the corals that you're growing are more resilient to warmer water than corals that grew in the ocean?
Sure. Those are all really good questions. So I'll start by saying that whatever country we're working in, which currently for us is in the Bahamas. You're interviewing me just hours after we had our groundbreaking ceremony for our farm in Grand Bahama. It'll be the world's first land-based commercial coral farm for reef restoration.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Super exciting day. So the corals we always use are native to the country we're working in. So that's a really important baseline to start with. We're not introducing any invasives or anything like that. So to begin with, the way we grow them faster, it's known as microfragmenting. And as I said before, it was pioneered by Dr. David Vaughan from the Mote Marine Lab and is being used in different places around the world now. So corals, they have these natural healing mechanisms within them. You imagine almost like we have scar tissue. So whether it's from a parrotfish nibbling on them or rock falls and gashes the coral, whatever it may be, they have an ability to sort of heal. And so what microfragmenting is you take cuttings of corals, almost imagine taking cuttings of a flower or tree that you could then plant. So we take cuttings of living coral, bring them to our farms on land, where we can then basically cut up the corals into smaller pieces and space those pieces near each other, but with some distance in between. And the corals basically then use their natural healing process and fuse back into themselves. And so that we can sort of cut them and repeat using this process that comes from within them, so that some species of corals that normally could take 20, 30, 50 years to get to the size of a dinner plate, we can now grow in 6 to 12 months. So that's how we grow them faster. As far as how we grow them stronger, there's a lot of research ongoing in this field of assisted evolution. Researchers all around the world, some of the top coral scientists, are looking into different ways to help coral survive warming and acidifying oceans. So a lot of that research is still ongoing and the sort of impact is unknown. So we want to be very cognizant of that. Human beings, despite best intentions, do have a track record sometimes of unintended consequences. So we are mindful of that. One of the things that our land-based farms offer compared to sort of traditional underwater ocean-based farms is we control the growing conditions for our corals so that we can look at scientific projections for warming and acidifying oceans in 2030, 2050, 2100, and adjust the temperatures or pH in our tanks to reflect those future conditions and basically stress test the corals, take the corals to the gym, make them know what a jacuzzi kind of feels like, bring the temperatures back down, and then outplant them. And that's already been shown through that conditioning method to boost the survivorship of corals, in some cases up to 80 to 90%. In some of our advisors' field work. And those corals then in turn are still reproducing in the wild as they would do naturally. So it's a pretty straightforward process, but it's really exciting to know that we can now grow much more diverse species of corals at a cheaper rate and also taking steps to help improve their ability to survive changing ocean conditions.
That's really impressive, Sam. So when you say 80 to 90% survival rate for those efforts, for those corals that have been taken to the gym, so to speak, does Coral Vita have any data on what you're doing in terms of your coral farming? Like I know that you are still a new startup, but in terms of survival rates for the coral that you would be transplanting back into nature after you're done farming them?
Yeah, well, so as you pointed out, and coming from our first groundbreaking, we as Coral Vita, we've been in the startup phase for a while, fundraising and finding the right target location, which ultimately was in Grand Bahama in partnership with the Grand Bahama Port Authority here. So our data doesn't really exist yet, but looking at our advisors out at the Gates Coral Lab, Moat Marine Lab in Florida, as well as other folks around the world, there's a lot of data out there on sort of the survivorship, the growth rates, and the success rates of restoration projects. And be frank to say that not every restoration project has been successful, but I think that's one of the benefits for us coming into the game after so many incredible people in countries all around the world have been doing this is having lots of teachable lessons as far as, okay, you need to be cognizant of site location for restoration, and here's how you want to transport the corals, and what you should do while handling them, and best time of the year to plant them. And so that we're able to integrate all of these best practices that, again, some incredible folks who we owe a lot of sincere tributes to have sort of proven out over the years. But for those who really want the data, I would definitely look at the Moat Marine Lab, among others, to see their sort of track record thus far.
How much coral have you raised, and what's your goal?
So with this first farm coming online, it's a pilot scale. Again, using the science that's been proven out, but also really the innovation for us is demonstrating that we can sort of do this as a for-profit for good, that people will pay for restoration work. So the first farm in Grand Bahama is going to grow a few thousand corals every year. And then our intention is we will scale up operations. We're going to raise another round of investment, a Series A, to finance our first large-scale or potentially large-scale individual farm or potentially large-scale farms. And at that scale, we would be growing several 100,000, if not millions of corals every year. And to just sort of translate that, our pilot farm growing a few thousand corals, that'll translate into about an Olympic-sized swimming pool worth of reef. And if we're doing hundreds of thousands or millions of corals from each farm, that can supply, miles of coastline. And in terms of the scale, one of the biggest projects ever to date is about 40,000 coral fragments a year. So we're really trying to take this to a whole nother level to really have the impact and scale needed to really protect coral reefs for the future. So ultimately, after this pilot farm and then the sort of the next large scale farm, which likely will be in the Caribbean, our intention is we want a global network of land-based farms in every country with reefs around the world that are supplying these restoration projects with diverse and resilient corals and getting customers to pay for that restoration work. So from this one pilot to about 100, we'll see how long that takes, but that's our plan for now.
You mentioned that you raised a round of capital. How much have you raised so far?
So we raised about 1.1 million in our seed round from private investors, and then another 500,000 or so from prizes and grants and fellowship and the like. So in total, about 1.6 million for this first farm in Grand Bahama.
And when you say from private investors, is it like a friends and family round? Are you going to venture capital funds? Like who are those private investors?
It largely was from angels, call them impact angels, people who have a deep passion for the ocean as well as deep pockets, who really believed in what our vision is for helping keep reefs and the communities who depend on them sort of healthy and around for the future. So we definitely think that this can be a profitable business, but at that early stage level of investment, and this is something I think a lot of other social and environmental entrepreneurs have faced, and I hope this is something that changes for the whole sort of investing community, is that the bigger funds and firms tend to be a little bit hesitant about putting in early stage investment. We talked to a number of VCs or bigger impact funds that said, look, we love what you're doing, but you're too early stage for us. Talk to us when you're at the Series A. And then that's sort of that chicken and egg. Okay, it was like, well, how do we get to the Series A if we can't do the pilot? So largely we were able to find some very passionate ocean types who were able to help support us. And so a few people I can call out: Sven Lindblad, who's a pioneer in ocean exploration and ecotourism; Max Scherzer, who's actually the Cy Young award-winning pitcher for the Washington Nationals; Yale University, where Gator and I graduated from, put in some money for us, and then one or two impact funds. But by and large, it was these people who really believed in our mission and are sort of with us for the long haul. And then moving into the Series A, that'll be raised in about 18 or 24 months or so.
Good for you all. That's really great. Got a great diverse group of investors there. So you mentioned Yale, and I think that you and Gator met at the Yale Entrepreneurship Institute. Is that right?
We both completed the institute together after sort of coming up with the idea for Coral Vita. We met at the School of Forestry where we were getting our master's degrees.
Got it. So what is the difference between the Yale Entrepreneurship Institute and Yale where you were at grad school? Like, could one go to the Entrepreneur Institute without going to Yale?
If you were a professor. So pretty much no. It's actually, they also changed the name. When we were there, it was the Yale Entrepreneurial Institute. Now it's the Sci Center, TSAY for innovation. But yeah, it was basically a program primarily for Yale students and faculty and staff to sort of empower their ideas for innovation. And so they had an innovation fund, which is we had ultimately got investment from, which was available to the graduates from their entrepreneurial program. And I believe we were the first sort of social environmental venture to receive investment from Yale. So that was very exciting. But yeah, it was something available to undergrads, people from the medical school, business school, and for us from the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies as well.
Nice. So, Sam, tell us about artificial reefs. Obviously, you are creating actual, real, natural corals that you can create genuine coral reefs with. But I know there are efforts to create artificial reefs that seem to attract marine wildlife to live near and on them. Is that right? And if so, why is one preferable to the other?
Yeah, so artificial reefs have been put into place in different places around the world, some of which have been very successful, and some of them have given us good lessons of what not to do. I think one of the best cases of the latter is filling tires with cement and sinking those offshore. That turned out to be not something anyone should ever do again. But there have been cases where people either sink old ships, the batch of old New York City subway cars, as well as stuff a little bit more advanced like 3D printing or creating cement structures for to be sunk as artificial reefs. So one of the things I think that's very complementary with what Coral Vita does in those artificial reef projects is that both of them want corals. And so you sink these artificial reef structures because corals typically don't really grow in sand. They need a surface to grow on. But when they die, either algae takes over or that, often the rock that corals grow on will start to dissolve. And so it's hard for corals to recover. But if you give them a surface, they have an opportunity for their populations to sort of rebound. So that's why people often put these artificial reef structures out there. The thing is, though, it takes time for corals to come around and to grow. And so if someone sinks an artificial reef structure, whatever form it may be, if Coral Vita had a farm operating in that country, we actually could be like, great, sink that structure, and now we'll have corals ready for you to go, in the next 6 to 12 months, as opposed to having to wait 6 to 12 years for those corals to come around, sort of just via the ocean. So there's some really interesting opportunities, I think, especially around 3D printing for artificial reef structures, and especially creating substrates that promote reef growth and fish habitat and suppress wave energy. So very excited to see what can potentially come from sort of these complementary activities.
Is Coral Vita about aiding imperiled reefs or creating new reefs where none previously existed?
We're primarily focused on restoring reefs where they once were or still are, but are degraded. But if the oceanic conditions allow for it, and there's sort of a historical record of corals being there, we have the potential to create new reefs. But really, it's the ecological sort of functionality and sort of sound principles of the project always come first for us. So it does depend on the local condition about what we can do. But if a hotel has got a reef off their property that's degraded, they could hire us to restore it. Or if those conditions allow for it, we potentially could create a new front porch reef for them that their guests can enjoy and that would shelter their coastline from storm surges and erosion. So I think both are options for us.
Have you seen interest or have you felt the interest from these hotels?
Yeah, we have. So our first partner in this pilot farm I mentioned earlier is the Grand Bahama Port Authority and Development Corporation. So we're already seeing a lot of interest from sort of resort and coastal developers. And for them, it's kind of a win-win situation, right? Because we're saying you can restore the reefs off your coast that protect shorelines from storms and that have a tourism and fishing draw, for the cost of a hotel to maybe resurface their pool deck or do their landscaping work for the year. So with these developers as our sort of initial platform, we're already looking at future farms in Mexico and the Seychelles, Australia, Colombia, and in many of these places, whether it's individual resorts or chains, they've all sort of expressed an interest in seeing how this first pilot goes and then moving on from there. And one of the ways I think there's an interesting tie-in is not only having a hotel itself as a customer or a government or a individual coastal property owner, but these new conservation financing mechanisms that are coming online. So as an example, Swiss Re, which is the second biggest reinsurer in the world, is piloting a scheme in Mexico with hotel owners and the government, basically saying, look, these reefs protect your coastlines from storms. So if you hotel owners, together with the government, sort of work and pay to restore these reefs, your premiums will go down. That's a pretty good market driver for people to restore reefs, in addition to obviously the tourism draw of having a beautiful fish and colors around your reef in your hotel. So that, along with the world's first blue bond just launched in the Seychelles, the Seychelles as a country just had its a chunk of its foreign debt forgiven in exchange for investments in conservation and sustainable development. So looking to tie into a lot of these schemes and policies and customer bases that really rely on the health of reefs and also are promoting activities to help restore ocean health. It's a really great opportunity, I think, for us and other people inside the blue economy.
Do you have someone on your team who is looking out for those types of policy changes?
You're kind of talking to them.
Startup life.
Yeah, the many hats that I wear. I mean, Gator's certainly involved in that too. I previously worked for a group called the Global Island Partnership, or GLISPA, while I was in grad school. And it's a coalition of island nations and partners co-chaired by the heads of state of 4 different island countries. And, other groups involved include the U.S. State Department and the Nature Conservancy, Conservation International. And they not only are sort of involved in a lot of these really progressive policy and financial moves, but have this global network of island nations. And so I previously worked with them, and actually now Coral Vita is officially a member of GLISPA, which is super exciting. That was a recent development for us. So with my sort of background with that, I also formerly worked on climate change adaptation policy in the White House back when that was still a priority. And
that was in the first year of the Trump administration? No, just
yeah.
kidding.
No comment.
Right, yeah.
So, having that policy background it's definitely sort of led into me having a good sort of thumb on the pulse of what's happening in that space. But like I said, depends what day you talk to me or Gator, what hat we're wearing and what kind of work we're doing.
So, Sam, allow me the faux pas of quoting you to yourself, but I was reading an article, or rather an interview with you, and you said that charities have done a great job of laying the framework for reef restoration movement and developing some of the techniques necessary to do this type of work, but they haven't been able to scale up to make a significant impact when you're thinking about global reef degradation. So tell us why you went into business. What is the limiting factor you think that charities have that you are not going to be constrained by as a business? So if somebody wants to save the reefs, they might think about, I want to go work for ocean conservation charity or maybe go into public policy. Why did you choose the route of business?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, like I said, my background was policy and working for a nonprofit. So those are two things that I love. And I can actually one day see myself getting back into them. So that's not to say they're not effective, but for the scale of this challenge with global coral reef degradation, we need to move fast. We need to move big. And we need to spend money. And I think there are some key limiting factors in nonprofits and charities and the policy space that limit, those types of moves. For one, so I touched on this, but didn't go into a great deal of detail. So traditionally, coral farming is done with these underwater farms. That's what I did in Mauritius. That's what a lot of projects do all around the world. And again, it's helped prove out the space and has led to some tremendous results, especially, I can call it some awesome projects like Fragments of Hope in Belize and the Coral Restoration Foundation and Nature Seychelles. So those are all good projects and they need to continue, but there's limited types of coral species you can grow. You can only really grow the fast growing ones and not use those microfragmenting methods. If you want to enhance the resilience of the corals, you don't have the ability to control the growing conditions. You're at the whims of the ocean, which also includes being at the whims of the ocean if there's a storm or a fisherman drops his anchor. And then you also have to basically set up and maintain one of these underwater farms near each reef you want to restore. So in addition to putting out a commercial high-tech model, Coral Vita is doing land-based farms. And while it may be more costly up front to acquire land and buy tanks and pay for electricity, at scale, there's a number of factors it offers. So one, it actually becomes cheaper to grow corals on land than it does underwater. The average price for an underwater farm is between $40 and $70 to grow and install each coral. And based on our advisors at Moat, we project being able to grow and install corals on land for $10 per coral, and there's potentially ways to get that down to even $2 per coral. So it's cheaper to begin with. But if you're a nonprofit with tight budgets, it's tough to buy land and it's tough to buy all that upfront capital and infrastructure costs. And so it's just not often in the realm of possibility for a lot of these NGOs and nonprofits. Then also by doing it on land, obviously we can make the corals more diverse, more resilient, and all the other things I sort of outlined before. So you take that all together and then throw in the final factor where, depending on one-off grants and donations, can help with small-scale projects for sure. But if we need to be growing, millions, if not billions of corals every year to keep reefs around, we need to come up with a more financially sustainable system to support that kind of work. And that traditional charitable donation and grant model, it just, in our view, isn't going to cut it. It's not to say it should stop. And we actually see lots of ways to collaborate with these nonprofits as well as local communities to do our work. But ultimately, you take all those things together. That's why we felt taking a for-profit approach to coral reef restoration is really the way forward to really have the impact needed to keep reefs alive for the future.
Nice. So you mentioned it's $10 per coral, and earlier in our conversation, you actually talked about the Adopt a Coral program. But I just wanted to return to that real quick because there's right now there's programs where you adopt a tree, right, and there are also adopt an animal where you physically adopt an animal, but you basically sponsor an animal. And I've purchased as gifts for people like a farm animal at a sanctuary, and then they get a photograph of, like a pig who has a name, and this is the animal who is being sponsored in the gift recipient's name. Have you thought about doing something like the Adopt a Coral program where people would maybe get like a picture of the coral they're adopting? Like you could give it as a gift for the holidays. Like I spent $10 and I got Tony a coral that now is named Tony and it's going to get put out into the ocean.
Well, it's funny you should ask that. We are actually currently doing that. So we've already had people adopting corals for birthdays and for the holidays.
Nice.
And again, this is something we've let them know that the farm isn't up and running yet, but their donation will directly go into helping corals once things are operational. And right now they get a sort of certificate saying that they've helped adopt a coral and helped with its growth and outplanting. And then, we're planning on, getting pretty interactive, and we'll be able to sort of take photos and show them the growth and progress of those corals and how it's helped translate into the health of the overall marine environment. So if you go onto our website at coralvita.co, there's an opportunity for people, if they want to go ahead and adopt corals. And then also, in addition to doing it online, if people get the chance ever to come to our Grand Bahama farm or other farms in the future, they'll be able to either adopt corals on site, or if they really get excited, they can even play to come out and plant corals with us, or with the local dive shops, get a reef restoration dive certification, which something as a personal scuba diver, it's It's kind of always a fun thing to get another, like a night dive certification or a cave dive certification, and so to have that opportunity for people to give back and also, really get a great sense of personal satisfaction in helping bring the ocean health back to life.
All right. So for my friend Ari, who I hope is listening when we air this, that's the next certification we're getting.
Looking forward to it.
Sam, as we wind down here, I was wondering if you could please share any inspiring resources that were helpful to you in this process or would be helpful to a would-be entrepreneur.
Well, for a would-be entrepreneur, especially a social entrepreneur, there's a few different organizations. Gator and I would definitely love to shout out because they've been huge resources for us along the way. So we're graduates of the Halcyon Incubator in Washington, D.C., HALCYON. We're also currently fellows in the JMK Innovation Prize, as well as Echoing Green. And all these are basically either incubators or fellowships for social entrepreneurs that come with financial support, but really, in addition to sort of expert advice and workshops and mentoring, just a really phenomenal group of fellow entrepreneurs and innovators who really, I think that's where some of the best resources come from your friends and people who've gone through this before. So I definitely encourage people to check out those and other organizations. And yeah, I mean, I think
any books that you recommend, Sam? Any for anybody who might be thinking about starting their own company, or maybe they want to do something for the planet?
This is gonna maybe come out of left field, but I would read. I believe it was called Leadership, but I would read about Abraham Lincoln. I would read a book on the leadership lessons of Abraham Lincoln, because so much of what comes about in entrepreneurship is not only having a good idea, but really having the right team and having the right story and getting people to believe not just in what you're doing, but in who you are. And also timing matters a lot. And I think in addition to just being an amazing person who, held together the United States in an incredible trying time and was progressive in helping end slavery and so many other things, there are some great lessons in leadership, which translate into entrepreneurship from Lincoln. So
it's funny that you say that because Paul daily quotes Abraham Lincoln and really looks up to him as leader.
There you go. This is, there's a reason why we connected here, huh?
Yeah, exactly.
Outside of my environmental hat, I'm actually a huge military history nerd. That's my favorite subject to study. So I think there's a lot, in addition to just being fascinated by strategy and tactics, I think there's a lot of good lessons from that space that translate into what we're doing. But one other thing I would just sort of say as far as the philosophy goes is, especially with a lot of these environmental and social challenges, right? It doesn't matter what field you're in, but particularly if you're taking on a sort of mission-driven approach, there's a lot of daunting challenges to just the nature of the problems, maybe not getting as much investment or financial support as, a sort of normal tech entrepreneur might get. The just burdens of sort of, how heartbreaking often a lot of these problems can be. But I guess one philosophy I've taken the whole time is, look, if we can make this work, then hopefully we really can make a difference and we can really change the world and work with local communities to bring reefs back to life. And if we don't, then we tried, and I'll move on to the next thing and try and solve that. So I think it's important to learn from failure. It's pretty cliche. But truly, having the ability to sort of build up a personal resilience, I think is critical for any entrepreneur, and believing in what you're doing and sort of keep moving forward, but not having a sense of fatalism, I think is crucial, and has been really helpful over the past few years getting this going.
Nice. Well, thanks, Sam. To wrap us up for a final question here, at the end of every episode, we always ask our guests to name either something or maybe some things or some people for whom you are grateful. So let us ask you, Sam, for what are you grateful in this world?
I'm grateful to my mom and dad for getting me scuba certified, along with my brother, who's been a role model for me over the years. Grateful to have found a friend and, partner to solve this problem together with Gator. And I think grateful for the the people who depend on coral reefs, the fishermen and their families, local island communities, people who often aren't the cause of a lot of these problems, but are so dependent on the health of the ocean and reefs and the environment, and are also often so, determined to make things work, even though, it's not necessarily problems they created. So for that, I'm definitely grateful to work in such an incredible space, and appreciate the opportunity to speak with you guys today, and hopefully get some of your listeners excited about why coral reefs matter, and hopefully they'll come down and plant some corals with us.
Well, we're grateful for you to coming on the show. Thank you for your time. And please let our listeners know where they can find you.
You can find us at www.coralvita.co, or Instagram is at Coral Vita Reefs. And if you do at Coral Vita Reefs on Twitter and Facebook, we're there too. And if you physically want to come hang out with us, we are on the island of Grand Bahama, just off the coast of Florida. So yeah, come on down and enjoy the reefs with us.
Well, thanks so much, Sam. We're grateful to you for everything that you're doing to try to improve the planet and the ocean health, and trying to save all animals, including corals. So thanks so much, and we will look forward to keeping up with you.
Me as well. Thanks so much.
All right, folks, thanks so much for listening to the show.
We hope you got a lot out of it and that you will show us some love. You can rate Business for Good as 5 stars on iTunes, support us on Patreon, and tell your friends interested in business, or really just in making the world a better place, about the show.
And we'd love to hear what you're thinking. Please feel free to contact us anytime via our website, businessforgoodpodcast.com.
And as always, we hope that you will be in the business of doing good.